Good evening. I'm Janet Gornick, Director of the Stone Center on Socio-Economic Inequality, and our center is co-host of this evening's event in conjunction with the China at CUNY initiative, the Ralph Bunche Institute for International Studies, and the Graduate Center's Office of Public Programs. And it's my pleasure to welcome all of you here, those of you in the in-person audience here in the Elabash Recital Hall, and welcome to the large virtual audience as well. This evening's event is one of the many public lectures, panels, and conversations offered here at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. Throughout each year and at the Graduate Center, we're proud of our history of applying research and scholarship to addressing current societal challenges, and tonight's conversation fits in with this tradition. These days, China is in the news here in the United States nearly daily, with most of the focus on trade disagreements and on military and strategic rivalries. But that said, our interests this evening lie elsewhere. Despite China's high profile in American public conversation, our perception, those of us who planned this evening, is that among those of us here in the United States, we actually know remarkably little about life in contemporary China, and we lack an understanding of the many dramatic societal, social, and economic changes that have unfolded in China in the last decades. So our goal this evening is to contribute to the process of demystifying China, which we know is a vast and complex country. So we chose this evening to focus on four particular areas of change that are of great interest to many. One is China's remarkable strides toward eradicating poverty. A second is the simultaneous growing inequality and the rise of a new and growing billionaire class. The third is the decline in the birth rate, despite the end of the one-child policy, and you're going to hear about that this evening. And finally, the increase in access to technology and its effect on the social landscape in China. So we've been very fortunate in that tonight we've gathered experts on each of these four areas. Let me first introduce our three guests, outside panelists. That would be Yong Cai, Qin Gao, and Rongbin Han. Yong Cai, who's sitting here, closest to me, right here. Well, second seat there. Is associate professor of sociology at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. His research focuses on China's one-child policy and the implications for fertility and for social policy. His work helped to provide the empirical foundation that persuaded the Chinese government to end the 3-decade-long policy. And he continues to monitor China's birth rates in the post-one-child era, now especially with the new focus on international comparisons and on population aging. To his left is Qin Gao. Qin is a professor of social policy and social work practice at Columbia University School of Social Work. She's the founding director of Columbia's China Center for Social Policy and a member of the National Committee on United States-China Relations. She's a leading authority on poverty, inequality, and social policy in China. Among her work in this area is her 2017 book, Welfare Work and Poverty, Social Assistance in China. To her left, yes. To her left is Rongbin Han. He's professor of international affairs at the University of Georgia. His research interests cover digital politics, political participation, popular contention, and state-society relations in authoritarian settings with a focus on China. He's the author or co-author of several books, including Contesting Cyberspace in China, Online Expression and Authoritarian Resilience, and more recently, Directed Digital Dissidence in Autocracies, How China Wins Online. I'm equally pleased to introduce our two other participants, both faculty members. Oh, yes, sorry, thank you. And our other two participants this evening are both faculty here at the Graduate Center. So sitting on the far end is Branko Milanovic. He's research professor here at the Graduate Center and a senior scholar in the Stone Center. Before coming to CUNY, he served as lead economist in the World Bank Research Department for almost 20 years, before we enticed him to come here. His main area of work is income inequality, both within countries and globally, as well as historically. Among his many books are two, both which were launched on this very stage: Capitalism Alone, The Future of the System That Rules the World, and Visions of Inequality, From the French Revolution to the End of the Cold War. Branko. And finally, our moderator, last but not least, our moderator is John Torpy. He's professor of sociology and history and director of the Ralph Bunche Institute for International Studies here at the Graduate Center. He's the author or editor of several books focused on an array of social and economic and intellectual transformations through comparative and historical lenses. He currently edits a series for Temple University Press titled Politics, History, and Social Change. So welcome to our guests, and John, I turn the panel over to you.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Janet. Thank you all for coming. This evening is kind of the realization of an aspiration I've had for a long time, which is to see us here at the Graduate Center pay more attention to China and to bring that knowledge to a broader audience, not just to our students and our faculty, but to the general public. And so I'm very glad to see you all here. And in that spirit, I wanted to start with what might seem a sort of ironic question, but we mean this in a certain sense seriously. Since this evening's point is to bring expertise to a broader array of people, we thought we would start with a kind of question about what people think that the American public thinks they know about China. So let me ask each of you to spend 30 or so seconds, not very much, but just to get us started. What do you think that the American public knows about China, and what are the sort of mistakes that they may be making in their understanding of China?
Thank you for the question. First of all, I want to say it's truly an honor to be here and to share my expertise. To answer your question, I think I thought about this. It's actually not an easy question to answer, because not only we need to assume what we know about the American public, but also know the Chinese public as well. So from my perspective, I think one thing is, if we read today's newspaper, there's so much tension there. And I think it's right for the American to view China as a competitor. But it's probably not the best way to approach China as an enemy, as we saw, that kind of rhetoric is already there. And the reason I'm saying this is that I recently visited China, and from my personal experience and from what I have read, there's a lot of goodwill and a lot of respect from China to our political, social, and economic system. So I think we should cherish that, and we should find a way to cooperate, between these two societies, two great countries. That's my take.
Great. Thank you very much. And the words competitor and enemy came up in that answer, and they may come back around. So let me turn it over next to Qin Gao.
Thank you, John. Thank you, Janet. I'm so happy to be here. I've long admired the CUNY Graduate Center. Wonderful to be in this space with you. To answer your amazing question, John, I think most Americans think of China as one China. They may consider China as rich, as unequal, as oppressive, as anything, but they may not realize how big and diverse China is in any of those regards. So just as most Chinese people may think of America as one America, they have one perception, but they may not realize the whole picture and the diversity and depth to that picture.
Big and diverse. I think that's very important. Rongbin.
Okay, thank you very much, Sean and Janet. Thanks for CUNY Center, Graduate Center, for bringing me here. It's a privilege and honor. About China, I think both Professor Cai and Gao have already said quite some of the things that I want to say. But also, I think the U.S. public is pretty diverse as well. There are people who knows China incredibly well, and there are some people who don't know much about China, and there are people who are not interested in learning more about China. But generally, I think in addition to kind of China is big, complicated, but also I wanted to highlight that China is a society that changes so fast. And that's a very incredible part of the whole story, because 20 years ago, we don't see China as a competitor or an enemy, because China is basically not that significant. Now it's the second like, largest economy in the world, our chief competitor, if not an enemy or what, right? So the change speed is something I want to bring to the audience.
Great, thank you very much. Next is Branko Milanovic.
Thank you, John. Actually, I would be rather brief, and I would just say about what I think, what the public thinks, because it's a heterogeneous public, in the area that I cover, which is growth and inequality. I think that, broadly speaking, American public does get things rightly in the sense that China has grown tremendously. So people are quite aware that China is now much richer than 20 or 30 years ago. And actually, I will show that later when I speak the societal change. When you do it empirically, you compare the societal change in China in 40 years, which is equivalent to social change in England during the Industrial Revolution over 200 years. So that's the speed of change. And I think that people in the US actually know that China has become a high inequality country. So on both accounts, growth and inequality, I think they get things, broadly speaking, right.
Great. Well, thank you very much. I think those are great starter responses. And I want to turn now to our first expert, Yong Cai, who's basically a specialist on demography and comparative demography and the history of populations. And I want to ask him to talk a little bit about the one-child policy, which is probably broadly known about, but the one-child policy came to an end a few years back. And now he's working on other things, and we'll get into that. But maybe you could start by telling us, what was the one-child policy all about, and what were the consequences of that policy for Chinese society today?
Yep. Thank you for the question. So I want like to, start from the idea of one-child policy. Seems like it's a very simple idea, one child per couple. And this idea came out at the end of 1979, early 1980s. And we attribute a lot of things to the one-child policy. For example, China's rather drastic fertility decline. It turns out, if you look carefully, China's fertility decline happened before the one-child policy. China, on average, the number of children per woman was about 6-ish in the 1970s. By 1978, it had already declined to 2.7. And for the first decades of one-child policy, fertility stayed above 2. So there's a kind of mismatch between the rhetoric and what really happened on the ground. So demographically speaking, the one-child policy's direct effect is actually, relatively speaking, small. The other factors, like what we demographers call demographic transition, just like industrialization, it's a force, social force, basically predicting when we live better, we got better life. Mortality was the first coming down, and with a delay, fertility, people start to realize, hey, we don't need to have that many kids. So that's exactly happened in China early on. During the first decades of the Communist Revolution, they reduced infant mortality rate rather dramatically. And then the population pressure started to kick in. Government started to put in some more soft approach to control fertility and to facilitate people reducing their fertility. So that's why in the 1970s, fertility came down rather quickly. The idea behind one-child policy was interesting because China indeed, was in a very much impoverished country. GDP per capita was $250 per person. And there was not enough food for everyone. That was the concern, and the concern was very much real. Chen Yun and Deng Xiaoping essentially said, this is our biggest problem, and we try to put our effort in. But it was not, even with that kind of draconian effort, fertility has its own, rules. It came down only rather late. After China's economy started to take off, people started to move into urban area. The grandparents have less influence on the younger generation, and people, most recent development is that the education level has skyrocketed. Half of Chinese young cohort are college educated. China is meant at about 10 million college educated kids per year, and all those things change China's perception about life and what kind of life they want to have. I think on one hand, I want to say the direct effect of one-child policy on fertility is relatively speaking small, but at the same time, the one-child policy did change the way how people perceive the fertility. It put a lot of emphasis on the economic side and less so on the social side. Why do we have kids? It's not for the purpose of economic gain. It's the meaning of our life. But that part has been diminished rather dramatically. People now, if we ask people, why don't you want to have kids? It's too expensive. They immediately turn into the economic calculation. So,
Let me follow up on that. I mean, I think you've raised a really important issue, which is the declining fertility phenomenon. And it's not just in China. We're seeing this more and more around the world. Since you work on comparative demography, maybe you could talk a little bit about, how is China similar or different to the countries in the rest of the world in this regard?
So I think more than half of the world population now living in a country or in a place where fertility is what we call below replacement level. Replacement level is roughly every couple needs to have 2 kids to replace our population. And the United States was rightly so about 2-ish for about 20-some years, but ever since the economic crisis of 2008, our fertility has been declining rather dramatically. Most of East Asian countries, Japan's fertility has been below replacement since 1972. Korean's fertility is now returning a bit, but it's below 1. China's fertility is about 1.1, 1.1-ish, right around that corner. And the Eastern European countries, many Western European countries are on that boat. So there is a great anxiety about this. For a while, we were worried about a population bomb that basically, we will not have standing room for everyone. Now suddenly we feel that there's a pressure. And oftentimes there's also very much a racist tone because we are competing against each other with that very much a narrow nationalistic view. So we are in this situation together, and the whole idea of the reason behind that is I think we all face, yes, economic pressure, and we are taking away the meaning of the reproduction, the cultural and social meaning of reproduction.
Let me turn now to Qin Gao, who's a scholar basically of China's welfare and poverty policies. And this has already been hinted at, but I wonder if you could tell us, how it is that, somebody said, used to be that China wasn't really anything worth paying attention to. Well, after 1978, roughly, things started to change, and probably most people know something about this, but maybe you could talk about what happened, what did they do, what were the policies, and what worked.
Thank you. So China's poverty reduction certainly is a very successful story. We look at the world poverty picture. If you remove China, it's not so much a great success story, but if you put China in, it's a sharp decline in the world poverty rate. So China made great contributions to poverty reduction in the world. How did they do it? I think it's a combination of 3 things. One, some political loosening up so that people have room to be creative, to be innovative, to do what they can to move ahead. So that is one area, the political environment. Economic reforms certainly helped a lot. So the rising tide was lifting all boats. The millionaires, billionaires, there were so many more in China during this period, but also those who are at the low income, bottom of the income distribution also got lifted. Thus, poverty got reduced. Then the third aspect is what I study is social policy. So China did move forward in social policy in many different areas. For example, Dibao, which is what I study, called minimum livelihood guarantee. It's a cash transfer to low-income population. As long as your income is below the local poverty line, you get cash transfers. It's what we call an unconditional cash transfer. So that's very powerful. That helped many people who face different challenges, disability, unemployment, children, older adults, hardships in different ways. So that was very powerful. The second area of social policy or public policy is infrastructure building. That is amazing and unique area of growth in China. So I lived in a rural village, small village in northern China before age 6. About 300 families lived there. I remember vividly, we were desperate for water. It was a mountainous area. To get water, not even clean water, you need to just pray for the rain god to give us some rain we can save in the wells so that we would have a reserve. And that kind of challenge or deprivation, you can call it poverty. It's more than that. It's a kind of survival level deprivation, which the Chinese government saw and addressed in infrastructure building. So clean water, electricity, internet, they brought to all these remote areas, and roads. So all those supported poverty reduction, and coupled with economic development and political reforms during those periods, really lifted poverty, the people out of poverty.
Great, thank you very much. I mean, to me, this is just an event, a phenomenon of world historical proportions. It's not just about China, however, although China constitutes a big part of the change. So maybe you could talk about a little bit about, how did it take place in other places? Did they have similar policies? Did they have different policies? I mean, what makes China unique or similar to other places?
Thank you. Another great question. I think in China, what was unique about this period of the rapid development and poverty reduction was the combination of the strong power of central mobilization, political will, if you would, and then room for local creativity, local autonomy. So a lot of local governments said, we want to resolve local poverty. So that's how Dibao came about. Some wealthy cities, Shanghai was the first one, and a few other cities followed, said, we want to reduce our city poverty. So they spent money, they set up the policy, and then other cities followed. So I think the room for those local autonomy experimentation was really powerful. So this combination of central power and will and local room for experimentation and autonomy. China, I hope, will continue that and expand this amazing combination, because that is a good lesson to learn from China itself. Other countries also tried many different versions of social policies, such as this kind of unconditional cash transfers, but also conditional cash transfers. For example, if you want to get cash transfers to get out of poverty, you need to send your kids to school. You need to go to regular health checkups. Those are also very beneficial, but they need close monitoring and bear high administrative cost. And in China, that's also being experimented, but very costly in terms of administrative cost.
I mean, I think this is very interesting in the sense that, there's a certain amount of local autonomy that I think people might not expect. They might expect a top-down, heavy-handed kind of approach, and it's not necessarily like that. So maybe we can get into that in the next questions. But first, let me turn to Rongbin Han, who, as Janet announced, has worked basically on online politics, political contention in China. But particularly the online, the digital sort of side of things. Maybe you could start by telling us about the role that technology plays in politics in China and how it affects outcomes.
Thank you very much for the great question. First of all, I would highlight the role of technology in China. So generally, I would argue that technology plays a very central role in Chinese society in a number of ways, but there are reasons. Partially, it's people familiar with Chinese history knows that China sees itself as the victim of the Central Long humiliation. A big part of that story is that China lags behind in science and technology, so they need to catch up. So if you look at Chinese official narrative and also popular narrative, there's a strong urge of national revival. At the heart of that is like catch up technologically. So that's one point. Another point is that I said, for instance, China changes very fast. And one of the contributing factors is because China adopts the technologies very fast. Anecdote story, I was in Beijing 2015. I was the only idiot there standing, kind of paying cash to get McDonald's. Everybody else was kind of cashless payment. It was only a few years before I visited China again. It's like, only like 2 or 3 years. All that happened just within that kind of short time span. So that was very incredible. But anyways, as a political scientist, I'm interested in the relationship between technology and politics. So let me just briefly zoom in and try to kind of answer the question from a certain perspective by looking at what does that mean for the Chinese government? How does the Chinese government sees everything, the technological development? I try to be brief and simple here. So generally, I think the Chinese government sees the technological development as an opportunity, a source of many different challenges, and also can be very useful tools. So it's an opportunity for the Chinese government because the Chinese government has long seen the development of technologies, especially the information technologies, as an economic opportunity to catch up with the West, as well as a technological opportunity there. So you look at China, China has created its own digital ecology, essentially, curated a number of those huge IT giants. So instead of Google, we have Baidu. Instead of like Twitter or X, there's Weibo. And instead of YouTube, you have Bilibili and everything. And some of the apps now, in some of the realms, China is a leader even. Like I remember a few years ago, New York Times had a short video introducing the super app, WeChat, which is banned by a number of the states within the US. And also TikTok, right? You have heard about that stories. And it gave China a huge boost in the economy, right? And it's also a technological kind of catch-up story there. People looking or reading news, it's not difficult to find headlines saying that China is catch up there or China is a major competitor with US in AI, right? So there are so many stories. The Australian Policy Institute had a study who tracked, they tracked the technological development for about 2 decades and identified the leaders in 64 technologies. China was only leading 3 or so at the beginning of the century. Now guess how many sectors China is leading? 57. So you can see a huge change, and China is becoming a leader now in technologies, not just digital technologies. Now, I mean, spending too much time on this, but then China sees, the government sees technology as a source of many challenges. I'm going to talk primarily about 2. One, the information technologies empower people, right? People use the internet to better communicate with each other, to organize, to mobilize, and sometimes to challenge the government. So the government introduces a number of mechanisms trying to control and regulate there. And in addition, the technological development itself is a huge challenge to regulate. You might have heard about the problems of privacy, for instance, or a monopoly. Those issues the government have to take care of. Now, finally, technological development provides tools for the government to better govern and also to better control. So there are 2 stories. We have heard a lot about the control stories, right? The government uses the new technologies to surveil people, to control people's mobilization. You probably heard about the red or green code system during COVID. But at the same time, technologies provide the government powerful tools to enhance its governance, to deliver service to people. And the Chinese government have a lot of those kind of websites right now. On each government website, typically you will find a petitioning channel or a kind of a mayor's box where people can submit petitions or complaints, and the government do respond. And that actually is very, very important.
Great. So maybe you could follow that up with a little bit more discussion about the relationship between state and society, between, somebody, I think, in the first questions used the word repression or oppression, I'm not sure. But, that might be the main way that we think about contemporary mainland China, but maybe you could add a little nuance to that perception.
Right, thank you very much. I think we can talk a little bit about the general characteristics of the Chinese political system. So we political scientists generally call China an authoritarian regime. So there is definitely a repressive aspect. But a lot of the times, China specialists like me also use an adjective. For instance, we call China a responsive authoritarianism, or a benevolent authoritarian regime. So it's like those adjectives kind of qualify the degree of authoritarianism in China. So looking at China just from the kind of state-society confrontation aspect is not getting us the whole picture, right? So as Professor Qin Gao have already mentioned, that it's like Chinese government have done amazing jobs in certain realms. And as I mentioned, that the Chinese government do care about what people think, and they try to respond. But of course, there's the repressive aspect. So looking at the kind of state-society interactions, and in terms of what is allowed and what is not allowed, we have some kind of general findings. So we can maybe categorize the opposition in two broad categories. One is not tolerated. Typically, that's political dissent. You can't organize an opposition party and challenge the party's kind of power to rule. You can't advocate, say, for instance, the independence of Xinjiang, Tibet, or Taiwan. And that's basically taboo topics if you are trying to say anything online, for instance. But at the same time, there are certain types of complaints are tolerated, especially when it is related to personal grievances or specific governance problems. For instance, if you complain about environmental protection, pollution problems, it's kind of okay-ish. If you report local officials' corruption cases, the government provides channels for you to do that. If you report noise on a square, traffic problems, all those issues, typically the government will tolerate it. But again, I wanted to add a quick footnote here. Tolerated doesn't necessarily mean it's like you're not going to be censored or you're not going to be punished in one way or the other, okay? Especially considering that local governments sometimes have incentives to suppress such complaints. Why? Because they don't want to look bad in front of their upper levels or the superiors. They want to block the signal you're trying to send to upper levels. So the central government are okay with that because that helps them discipline local officials.
Very helpful, very illuminating, it seems to me. So we're now going to turn to my colleague, Branko Milanovic, but while I'm talking to him, before I'm done with him, you might want to think about questions you might have for each other so that we can have a little bit of a conversation on stage. But let me turn to Branko Milanovic. Let me ask the question first before he's out of the gate. Branko has been working on the transformation of the Chinese and other elites in recent years, and there's been a big transformation in the nature of the Chinese elite, and I think you could talk about that probably at great length, but you've got 3 minutes.
Well, first I want to comment actually on what Professor Han said. Actually, I do have a problem with China's fast technological development because I still like to pay in cash. And that has become, as you said, really harder and harder. First, I would just simply would like to remind people of an obvious thing, which of course everybody has mentioned, is that China has grown in a way which has never been seen in history. I mean, we have never had so many people increase their income so much over such a long time. It's just a unique phenomenon in world history. So we have to take this always as a background, and particularly for young people, because they got used to China being middle income or upper middle income country, they don't know or forget actually the size of the change which has happened. Now that change, which was in real incomes, as Qin was saying before, had also a counterpart in increasing inequality. And so this is the graph which shows you increasing inequality from the 1980s, when actually the household surveys and the data became available in China again. They were actually available in the 50s, but many of these data have been lost. And then during the Cultural Revolution, for 10 years, there was nothing. And then you actually see that rapid increase, and you essentially see that in the last 10 to 12 years, stability of what is called the Gini coefficient, which measures inequality. So the higher this number goes up, the more unequal the country is. Overall, China is more unequal than the United States, and we know that the US is a fairly unequal country compared to the European countries. So China is indeed an unequal country. However, the inequality in China is different from the US inequality in the sense that lots of inequality is due to differences in mean incomes between the provinces and between rural and urban areas. So the dealing with inequality in China is different from dealing with inequality in the US in the sense that it involves geographical transfers or geographical investments. And I think in some sense it's more difficult to deal with it. Just to give you another comparison, inequality in China is about the same as the inequality in the European Union when you take 27 countries. And it's actually the structure is similar because European inequality is also, European Union inequality is also geographical. And finally, in 30 seconds, the next slide shows you simply, and I will just describe it, it shows you the change in the sources of actually background and sources of income of people who are in the urban top 5%. And as I was saying before, implicitly, what you have had what you can call it in the French term, embourgeoisement of China, in the sense that while in the past, most of the income and most of the people who were there were actually people who had income either from state-owned enterprises or from the government or from the party offices. Nowadays, of course, inequality is larger, so that actually bar is higher, but the structure of income is very different because private sector income has become now dominant. 2/3 of the total income is from the private sector, and more than 60% of the people are there, either large-scale capitalists, small capitalists, or professional managerial class. So there was a really big societal change at the top, even without talking about billionaires, because people who are here are the top 5%. They are not billionaires. They are actually affluent urban people.
So the elites have changed. They used to be based in the party, basically, and now they're independent entrepreneurs, more or less.
You know, the data are very unambiguous, although the 2023 numbers are still not in, and there may be, the last number here is 2018. But if you compare to 2018 with 1988, which is like 30 years, I mean, there is absolutely no doubt, actually. Of course, the top 5% now takes much more of a cake, overall urban cake, but the composition is really very interesting, because in the past you didn't have so-called large capitalists, people who employ more than 8 people. They were actually tiny. They were non-existent, very small. Well, now they are a larger group, and then you have other people, self-employed, you know, or people who hire other people, like you call it, you know, capitalists, and then you have professional managerial class, which was much smaller. So it is a dramatic, I said before, like it took England, because we have English data, landlords, capitalists, workers. For capitalist class to grow in size, it took 150 to 200 years. And in China, it took 40 years. So it is really a dramatic change in speed with which social composition has changed. Now, it could be, as I said, it could be the 2023, we will have the numbers that would not go into that same direction. Maybe we would have like numbers that look like 2018. That's my guess. So the transformation might have kind of slowed down.
So a question. How did the Chinese Communist Party decide to make this transformation that took place in 1978? Gorbachev announced glasnost and perestroika in the 1980s, and then the whole system fell apart, right? And he regretted that, despite the fact that he became a hero in the West for doing it. what led the Chinese Communist Party to change its stripes, so to speak?
That's, of course, a big question, and I would actually avoid the question. I think there are many elements there, including geopolitical element, but because one should not forget that actually the normalization of U.S.-Chinese relations happened when there was a triangular relationship between the USSR, China, and the U.S. So I think there were all these elements, and I think it was also a very good decision. Originally, there were, of course, a number of books on that, how China avoided the sort of debt trap in which East European countries fell. Because actually it's not known, I will just finish with that. I'm coming from Eastern Europe, but it's really not known the importance of the indebtment to the Western economies which actually drove these economies to basically bankruptcy. And if you look that back, Romania, Hungary, Yugoslavia, Poland were all heavily indebted. And that broke the contract which existed between, there was a beautiful book by Fritz Bartel, who is a political science professor. It's actually the elites and the people, there was end of contract because you basically could not repay the debt, incomes had to be reduced, and that was actually to some extent the end of socialism or communism. But China did not do that, and there is, of course, there are books on that. I would single out Isabella Weber's book, which was about the reform in China. So anyway, I tried to avoid the question, but I couldn't.
Sorry, I didn't mean to sandbag you. Does anybody have a question for one of the other panelists? Or a comment? No, any of you? Qin Gao.
I want to add to this point. The question is excellent. I think at some point, what people are experiencing, how they feel, really matters. I don't think it was, okay, by chance, there was the moment, there was the right leader who decided China can no longer continue with this high-powered control, not economic liberation movement. But at some point, it's bound to happen because people cannot continue to live in the desperate state, the lack of hope state. So it's in the long view, I think it's destined to happen, and then it takes the right political leaders and takes the right international environment. I think that's what can explain the 1978 departure. Professor Cai and I, and also Professor Wang Feng, together we have a new project. It's called the China COVID Project. We're looking at what happened in China during the COVID years and why there was the abandoning of the zero COVID policy. I think it's similar because people could no longer live like that. And the government at some point has to face reality and face how people are feeling. So there must be change.
Okay, I kind of have a question towards Branko and probably Qin here. Looking at the equality and Gini coefficient, and that's kind of pretty impressive. But we know that China is large, and in particular, we know that China has three major regions: the East Coastal region, the Central Belt, and the West region. And there's huge gaps in terms of economic development across those regions. And when we're using one indicator, Gini coefficient, to measure, say, the entire China, is it actually kind of, problematic in some ways? Because we know that, for instance, in Northeast China, your hometown, it's like the prices for everything is kind of much lower than, say, if you're in Shanghai or Shenzhen. Of course, people's income are much lower as well, right?
Well, in principle, I totally agree with you. There is no doubt, actually, it is a huge country, and actually, as I mentioned before, geographical differences are large, and urban-rural gap is large, although it is declining, the urban-rural gap. But what in principle, we do adjust for the differences in price levels between urban and rural areas. So there is some adjustment. And one thing that I also just would like to emphasize, it seems to me that anti-inequality policies in China are more difficult precisely because they involved either transfers from the richer provinces to the poorer or direct infrastructural or other investments, which also have their own political implications and de facto imply transfer from one region to another. Whereas in the US, what is actually interesting, if you were to actually make all US states have the same mean income, you would not reduce US inequality with very much, because there are, of course, differences. There is, New Hampshire, Connecticut is richer than Louisiana and Mississippi, but the gap is relatively small. So in that sense, anti-inequality policy in the US is policy to help people individually, whether they live in a rich country, a rich state like Massachusetts, or in Louisiana. And I think in China it's different. It's more difficult in some sense.
To add to this, I study inequality too, and we do the same, adjust for local cost of living. I think from the social policy perspective, the Chinese government, both the central government and local governments, also realize you have to address inequality from social policies. So there used to be no pensions in rural areas. Now there are pensions, and the pension levels are growing, even though it's still lacking behind the urban level, but there is a system. And the direction is to integrate the urban and rural systems. Same for health insurance. Similar things happened for Dibao, the minimum livelihood guarantee. Even though there are gaps, but the gaps are narrowing. So that will also contribute to the reducing of inequality. It's not to say inequality doesn't exist, but it's multi-layered, and there needs to be both economic and social policy measures to address it.
I kind of want to ask a somewhat generic question, which is, given the background that we've gotten from your various answers to my questions so far, I mean, what would you expect us to see from China in the coming years? And one thing that has struck me as a very much non-expert observer of China is the reach that China has had in recent years, overseas. Historically, China sometimes didn't let people out, didn't let people in, but it seems to be reaching out in a colonial kind of way. I mean, I don't want to characterize it because I don't really know enough about it, but there's the Belt and Road Initiative, there's the New Silk Road, there's investments in Africa, and investments in European ports. I mean, is this not what it appears to me to be, namely a kind of major transformation in China's understanding of itself?
I don't know if, as a demographer, I'm qualified to answer this question in any way, but I don't mind sharing a little bit of demographic perspective. For a while, China wanted to export its experience of population control to some African countries. But the angle was slightly different. There are two things I think it's meaningful to reflect on that. One is China, tied to the inequality part, China tried to persuade its rural peasants and basically sell the one-child policy or birth control policy as a poverty elevation program. Basically, if you observe, there's often a relationship between poverty and people having more kids. So they try to tie those two things together. Say, hey, if we can, we help you control fertility, that will boost your, there's within family demographic dividend. If few kids means less burden. You can work on, go get a job in the urban area, or maybe spend more time working in the field. So that's one, that aspect, try to tie economic development with the fertility control policy. The second part was the reproductive health. And again, China tried to sell that, say, hey, a good reason that we were able to control our fertility is to hear the needs of female side if we can provide those kind of service, and that will help us penetrate our program into rural area, to less developed area. And they say, maybe, as we are saying that lots of African countries still have, relatively speaking, higher fertility and fast population growth. So they try to, push that. But with the population control agency, the the Committee on Population Control now is disbanded, now it's part of the Ministry of Health. I think that the program is no longer existed.
I think what needs to happen for China is probably the government making fewer decisions, such as the One Belt, One Road, and influencing the rest of the world. They probably want to, but they need to also understand whether the people want to do it. I think there are some successes, but also some setbacks and failures. And it's also very costly to do it. As the Chinese economy has been slowing down since COVID, there needs to be money to be invested in these expansions and influences in other parts of the world. So I think there needs to be careful consideration and hopefully get off the back of the people so that they make more decisions.
One other question I wanted to come back to. I mentioned that enemy, the terms enemy and competitor were raised, I think, by you, Rongbin, so I'm going to ask this of you. How should we think about China? What is it to us? I mean, is it a competitor? Is it an enemy? I think you'd find a lot of approbation for the idea that it's our enemy in Washington, D.C. But no, I'm asking the political scientists, because this is the kind of question political scientists ask themselves and learn how to answer.
It's a very challenging question. And I do hope that people in DC and Beijing are listening, okay? So I'm always advocating for improved bilateral relations between US and China for a number of reasons. So first of all, there are a lot of realms where the two can collaborate and make this world a better place for all of us to live in. We're talking about like public health, environmental issues, like world peace, right? All sorts of those important things. Second, if the two don't get along well, and if there's a major conflict, the cost is high. It's going to be devastating. I know there are a lot of flashing points, right? Taiwan Strait issue, right? South China Sea issue, right? It's like China also has border disputes with India. A number of those places China is kind of busy with, but at the same time, the major one is the US-China relations. My sense is that the Chinese government doesn't really want a major conflict with the US, at least now, for a long time. And honestly speaking, before the trade war, when I talk to people in China, including average people and also some of those people in academia, maybe some of those mid-level officials, you can imagine how much they admire the US. The US was, and probably still is, a role model for China in many senses. And I think there's the possibility to avoid the conflict, okay? And a third reason, and from the US perspective, I think actually China can be kind of a benevolent external kind of, competitor in a sense. From the Chinese perspective, the pressure on US, I actually want a strong US, prosperous US. Why? Because it introduces some pressure on the Chinese government to work on the right things, to improve governance, right? Because you want to make the system more sustainable, or you want to convince the public that I have the legitimacy to rule. There's the US. It's a kind of, role model there. And if you don't behave, then people are going to be unhappy, right? So that's the rationale. I personally think the US now is a little bit divided on this, not sure. Many of the hawkish people, I think they're a little bit paranoid about the rise of China, so they're rushing to all the decisions. But anyways, I hope for world peace.
Okay. We share that hope, of course. So, Branko, perhaps the last comment. So if you're planning to ask a question, please begin to approach the mics. Thanks.
Since you brought up the international aspect, I will not talk about politics, but I would like to just bring two of factoids to some extent. The first one is that since I work on global inequality, China has been the engine not only for reduction of global poverty, that as Qin mentioned before, but also for global inequality. Now, that's the global inequality now, China is no longer the engine for that because it has become sufficiently rich that its further growth is not reducing global inequality. And actually it's an important point because that point implicitly tells you that the key source of reduction of global inequality and the key area where growth is indispensable is Africa. Because that's also the area which is demographically increasing, and it's not catching up. So really, the absence, China is, as I said, is out of that picture, but now we really have, if we look at global inequality, we have to focus on Africa and India and Bangladesh. And the second point about the Chinese influence in exporting the model, I would just say one sentence. I think the problem that China has, its growth is to some extent is largely idiosyncratic as a result of discrete events which happen. So it's very hard to tell somebody else what to do. We had the Washington Consensus, which was simplified, but it was kind of clear. Deregulate the prices, don't have tariff rates, high tariff rates, actually have market-determined exchange rate, interest rate should be market-determined. It was very simple. It was simplistic, but it was clear. China, I think, does not have a new consensus that could actually tell or sell easily to countries because of the idiosyncratic elements.
Yeah.
Thank you. Great. Thank you very much. Thank you all for coming. I want to just say quickly, I want to thank Janet Gornick and the Stone Center and the China at CUNY Initiative for putting on this event, and we look forward to putting on many more, and thank you all for coming.